The Egyptians made some magnificent things, but none of them mightier than me. The great Sphinx could never bark out commands to men in battle, but I did. The pyramids had no power to quiet a crowd of worshippers when the Pharaoh arrived with pomp and pageantry, but I could. I, you see, am the royal trumpet of the Pharaoh Tutankhamun, and this is my true story. Called a shinab in the language of my native land, I am the reason you take notice whenever a trumpet sounds. History, my history, has made the trumpet the unmistakable soundtrack for ceremony and spectacle. Its flourish evokes power and prestige. In fact, many believe that a trumpet will be the very last sound ever heard on earth, blown by Israfel or Gabriel to announce the judgment day. We trumpets are not meant to be ignored. I may seem bossy, but that is my job. I was invented to be heard and heeded above all the noise of everyday life. That sort of sound, think of your car horns, police sirens, or a fire alarm, is not meant to be soft and soothing. I am tasked to grab you by the ears and not let go until you do what Pharaoh commands. So wherever he went, I went too. For protection, I traveled with a wooden stopper stuffed down my throat to prevent catastrophe. That worked quite well for about 32 centuries until, well, I'll get to that later. This neck guard and I were decorated to resemble an Egyptian lotus in bloom. You can see its petals beautifully embossed into my bell, along with godly images and the royal name of young Tutankhamun. These hieroglyphs authenticate my divine voice, for I speak for Pharaoh himself. That is why you see gold at either end of my 23-inch length, shimmering where the god's breath went in and his voice came out. No, I was never born to make idle toes tap. As a shinab, I lack the separate cupped mouthpiece used on modern trumpets, nor have I got any valves to vary my length and thereby my pitch. This means that I cannot hum even a simple tune. I am a one-note wonder. That note is a simple middle C, and a raspy one at that. In fact, the Greek writer Plutarch later likened my sound to a braying ass. But then, even an ass can hit at least two notes. My one note rang out far and wide, communicating not in pitch, but in measured pulses, like your modern Morse code. This conveyed the message of the moment, for instance, a call to assemble for worship or for war. In fact, the majority of my duties were military in nature, rising above the din of battle to signal the Pharaoh's orders. Yet, no matter where I sounded, whether in peace or in war, it took considerable training to make me speak. So much so that the game-crazy Greeks later made trumpeting an Olympic sport, an event usually won by muscled heroes. Many of you would shudder at all that I saw and signaled during the reign of my Pharaoh, for at that time glorious Egypt ruled all the East. Whatsoever he commanded through me was the will of a living God. He was young and vigorous, with a long and illustrious reign stretching out before him, or so we thought. But one winter's day, a teenager still, his breath ceased to sound through me. No one now knows what illness or injury transformed Tut from living Horus to resurrected Osiris. I was plunged into silence. No royal tomb was ready to receive him so young. Thus attendants piled into a borrowed grave the treasures of their fallen Pharaoh, numbering 5,398 items, including 6 of his favorite chariots, 50 bows, stacks of boxes, beds, and of model boats. In those cramped quarters, clothing and cosmetics vied for space next to jewelry and jugs of wine. Even the 2 tiny mummies of Tut's stillborn daughters were stowed inside his tomb. In another room lay a lesser Shinab, shorter than me and made of gilded bronze, my dear little brother, the only other trumpet surviving from Pharaonic Egypt. I, of course, outrank him, and was therefore placed beside the Pharaoh within the burial chamber itself. Now do not in your modern way imagine for one blink of a millennium that I felt lost and alone deep in that dark abyss. We Egyptians do not dread the grave, nor do we fear what you perceive as the heavy burden of time. Along the Nile the buried stay busy. Tut, the eternal teenager, lived on. I could hear his bird-like ba, that is his soul or personality, come and go as it pleased, in and out of the tomb. And sometimes I sensed tremors as workmen nearby chiseled out more tombs, followed by the faint trudge of footsteps as funeral followed funeral in the Valley of the Kings. I now know that a tomb begun by Ramses V crossed directly above Tut's and continued 127 yards deeper through the solid rock, eventually angling over the tomb of Horemheb, whom I knew as one of Tut's generals, before bumping into the tunnels of yet another grave. It was like living inside a giant ant-hill. As I stood watch beside my Pharaoh, my stopper deep inside my throat, I was powerless to sound the gravest of alarms. 3 times brazen tomb robbers disturbed poor Tutankhamun and me. The first came early in the Pharaoh's afterlife. Greedy brutes broke through the outer doorways of the tomb and rifled to the antechamber among his personal effects. Their unclean hands pawed at Tut's jewelry, perfumes, oils, linens, and even the chest that contained my little bronze brother. Fortunately, sharp-eyed authorities discovered the crime and quickly restored order to the violated tomb. The heavy doors were resealed, only to be breached by more determined looters soon thereafter. This time they prowled the entire tomb, passing right by me in the burial chamber on their way to the treasury and back. Much was taken, but so were some of the thieves. I presume they were tortured and then impaled, according to custom. The royal scribe Jehuda Moza inventoried the disheveled tomb and hastily repacked its contents, leaving me wrapped in reeds beneath a beautiful alabaster lamp. There I lay until the third and worst of the plunderings. For a very long time the funerals had ceased. But then the digging began again. I noted the noise of tramping feet nearby and wondered what pharaohs were now seeking their rest in the royal valley. Little did I know that a new kind of grave robber was looking for Tut and me. The leader of this latest gang was a foreigner named Howard Carter, a patient and thorough plunderer, who worked for a wealthy overlord known as the 5th Earl of Carnarvon. On November 26, 1922 of your era, I heard them bang a hole through the antechamber door. I wanted to sound an alarm, but my breath was gone. Carter and his crew pillaged Tut's tomb for many years, although one of them, Lord Carnarvon, died early on from an infected insect bite. His demise helped ignite a silly rumor that the tomb and all its contents were cursed. This has become a mainstay of your so-called advanced civilization, and I resent the accusation. When my turn came in the clearing out of the tomb, Mr. Carter could not resist holding me to his lips and letting loose a loud blast that sounded through the Valley of the Kings. I hoped that this outrage would at least bring running the necropolis police, but no one arrived to arrest him. Instead, I was the one hauled away and locked up inside the Egyptian Museum at Cairo. I fumed without making another sound until February 1933, when I was summoned before a visitor named Percival Kirby, who had taken a keen interest in the musical instruments of Africa. He was allowed to sound my single note, but that was nothing compared to my next performance just 6 years later. A radio pioneer named Rex Keating arranged for me to broadcast a message from the Cairo Museum that would be heard around the world. Keating, of course, knew that I could only issue one clear note, and this he deemed unworthy of the great event. So he allowed a military trumpeter stationed in Egypt to stuff a modern mouthpiece down my throat in order to produce some sort of tune. During a rehearsal, I cracked under the strain. Then and there, in the presence of a latter-day pharaoh named Farouk, I fell to pieces. The horrified king, the trumpeter, and museum staffers dropped to the floor and scrambled to recover my scattered remains. All witnesses to this disaster were sworn to secrecy, lest the world be outraged at my mistreatment. While experts labored feverishly to restore me to life, Keating searched for a more reliable trumpeter. He chose a British bandsman named James Tappern, who treated me kindly according to my superior rank. At the appointed hour on an April evening in 1939, Trumpeter Tappern, using again a modern mouthpiece but now held safely in place by cotton batting, drew from me notes I had never heard before in my life. It was a brilliant performance, but not at all what could be heard from me back in King Tut's Egypt. Mr. Tappern's virtuoso recital, historic if not quite historical, soon became part of the curse of King Tut's tomb. Terrified listeners insisted that my sound somehow murdered at that very moment my abductor, Howard Carter, himself. This was nonsense, of course. He was already dead at the time. Even worse, I was accused of the greatest mass murder in human history, the carnage that you call World War II. My mighty voice over the radio allegedly summoned to battle a host of nations wielding weapons no pharaoh could ever imagine. But I assure you I gave no such commands. The wars that I started were all ancient. I've only sounded twice more since that day. In 1941, I produced a few notes as part of an acoustic experiment conducted at the Cairo Museum. Later, in January of 1975, I blared another brief solo. The trumpeter, famed musician Philip Jones, said of me, "Its sound was not exactly melodious, but it was probably the most thrilling experience I shall ever have as a trumpet player." Wait, did he say probably? Can you think of anything grander than touching your lips to the actual trumpet of an ancient pharaoh? But given my modern misfortunes, I may never risk sounding my single note again. I'm Dr. Frank L. Holt, thanking you for watching this episode of The Ancient World Speaks. I have done you a great favor by not playing my own trumpet in this video. So please do me a favor in turn by subscribing to this channel and telling your friends about it. I published an earlier version of this story in Aramco World magazine, illustrated beautifully by my friend Norman MacDonald. I hope to see you here for the next video.